In the suffocating blackness of the Iranian desert, a sound of grinding metal ripped through the night, followed by a flash of light so brilliant it turned the sand to glass and the darkness to day. A pillar of fire erupted into the sky, a man-made volcano of jet fuel and shrapnel, illuminating a scene of pure chaos. Men, the most elite soldiers in the world, were diving for cover, their faces lit by the hellish orange glow of a burning C-130 transport plane and the twisted, melting carcass of a Sea Stallion helicopter that had just sliced into it. 8 men were dead. More were horribly burned. This was not the result of an enemy attack. There was no ambush, no firefight. This catastrophe, unfolding at a secret landing strip codenamed Desert One, was entirely self-inflicted. The mission was over before it had even begun. This was the moment that the most ambitious, most secret, and most desperate rescue operation in modern history collapsed into a smoking ruin, leaving behind a scar not just on the desert floor, but on the psyche of a superpower. To understand how 132 of America's finest commandos ended up in this inferno of their own making, you have to go back 6 months to a world teetering on the brink. The year was 1979. For decades, Iran had been a cornerstone of American foreign policy in the Middle East. Its ruler, the Shah, was a staunch, if brutal, ally. He bought American weapons, he sold the West oil, and he kept the specter of Soviet influence at bay. The American embassy in Tehran was more than just a diplomatic outpost. It was a sprawling 27-acre symbol of this alliance, a fortress of American power and influence in the heart of the region. But the ground beneath it was shaking. A revolution, fueled by decades of resentment against the Shah's oppressive regime, and fired by the uncompromising vision of an exiled cleric, the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, was boiling over. In January 1979, the Shah fled his own country, leaving a power vacuum that was quickly and ruthlessly filled by Khomeini and his followers. The pillar of American policy in the Middle East had crumbled into dust. The United States, which had supported the Shah for so long, was now cast as the villain, the Great Satan. Anti-American sentiment, once a simmer, became a raging boil on the streets of Tehran. The embassy staff inside their compound could hear the chants, the roar of a nation remaking itself in an image of fierce independence and religious fervor. They were living on an island, and the tide was rising. The breaking point came on November 4th, 1979. President Jimmy Carter, against the advice of many of his diplomats on the ground, had allowed the terminally ill Shah to enter the United States for medical treatment. To the revolutionaries in Iran, this was the ultimate betrayal. It was seen as the prelude to another CIA-backed coup, like the one that had installed the Shah in power back in 1953. They would not let it happen again. That morning, a mob of students, organized and directed by the new regime, descended upon the embassy. They scaled the walls, armed with bolt cutters and revolutionary rage. The small contingent of Marine Guards was hopelessly outnumbered. They fired tear gas, but it was like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. Within hours, the compound was overrun. The symbol of American might had fallen. For the first time since the 19th century, American diplomats were seized and their embassy occupied. 66 Americans were taken captive. Some were seasoned diplomats, others were young administrative staff, military attachés, and the Marine Guards who had made a final futile stand. They were blindfolded, their hands bound. They were paraded before cameras, symbols not of American power, but of American impotence. Their faces, etched with fear and confusion, were suddenly on every television screen in the world. The crisis became a daily, national humiliation. In the United States, the news was relentless. Walter Cronkite began ending his nightly broadcast by reminding millions of viewers how many days it had been since the hostages were taken. The number just kept climbing. Day 50, day 100, day 150. Yellow ribbons were tied around trees across the country, a constant silent plea for their return. President Carter pursued every diplomatic avenue. He pleaded through intermediaries. He imposed economic sanctions. He froze billions of dollars in Iranian assets. But the Ayatollah Khomeini was unmoved. The hostages were valuable propaganda. They were leverage. They were a tool to humiliate the Great Satan on the world stage. As the weeks turned into months, the bleak reality began to sink in. Diplomacy was not going to work. For a president heading into an election year, the crisis was a political anchor, dragging him and the nation's morale down into the depths. He was perceived as weak, indecisive, a leader unable to project American strength. The pressure to do something became immense, not just from his political opponents, but from the American people themselves. And so, in the deepest secrecy, another option began to take shape, a military option, a rescue. It was a plan born of desperation, a roll of the dice with the highest possible stakes. The task was given to a man named Colonel Charlie Beckwith. Beckwith was a grizzled, hard-as-nails Green Beret veteran, the founding father of a brand new top-secret unit, the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force. They were America's answer to Britain's SAS and Germany's GSG-9. They were trained for the impossible, hand-picked from the best of the Army's best, but they were also completely unproven. This monumental mission would be their first real test. The plan they devised was breathtaking in its complexity and audacity. It was a multi-stage joint service operation that looked more like a Hollywood script than a military strategy. Stage 1, a fleet of 8 massive RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters from the Navy would launch from the aircraft carrier USS Nimitz in the Arabian Sea. Simultaneously, 6 C-130 transport planes, 3 carrying fuel, 3 carrying the 132-man assault team and their equipment, would take off from an airbase in Egypt. They would all fly hundreds of miles under the cover of darkness, deep into hostile Iranian territory, navigating by starlight and primitive inertial guidance systems to avoid detection. Their rendezvous point was a remote, desolate salt flat in the Great Salt Desert, a location they codenamed Desert 1. There, the C-130s would land on the makeshift airstrip, refuel the helicopters, and the Delta Force team would board the choppers for the next leg of the journey. Stage 2. The helicopters would fly to a second secret location, Desert 2 in the mountains outside Tehran, where they would hide until the next night. Stage 3. The following night, the assault team would be driven into Tehran in pre-arranged vehicles, storm the embassy compound, and another building holding 3 senior diplomats, free the hostages, and escort them to a nearby soccer stadium. At the same time, a separate team of Army Rangers would seize a nearby abandoned airfield. The helicopters would then land in the stadium, pick everyone up, fly them to the captured airfield, where C-141 Starlifter transport jets would be waiting to fly everyone to safety. Every single piece of this intricate puzzle had to fit perfectly. One mistake, one mechanical failure, one compromised secret, and the entire house of cards would come crashing down. It was a plan that demanded flawless execution, perfect weather, and an extraordinary amount of luck. The hopes of a nation, the lives of the hostages, and the fate of a presidency rested on what would happen on that first night at that lonely patch of sand and salt called Desert 1. It was there, where the first crucial link in this impossible chain was to be forged, that everything would instead begin to burn. The problem began not with a bang, but with a grain of sand, or rather, trillions of them, suspended in the air. For the pilots of the C-130s, flying high above at 20,000 feet, the journey to Desert 1 was eerily calm. They were a silver arrow shot into the heart of Iran, flying in total radio silence, their world a cocoon of humming engines and the glow of instruments. But hundreds of miles behind them and thousands of feet below, the helicopter crews were flying into a nightmare that no one had predicted. Their flight path took them low, skimming the desert floor at just a few hundred feet to stay below Iranian radar. It was here they encountered the Haboob. This was not a simple sandstorm, a wall of churning grit that could be seen and perhaps flown around. A Haboob is an altogether different beast. It is a colossal, suffocating cloud of dust so fine it behaves more like a fluid than a solid. It's a phenomenon of micrometeorology, created by atmospheric downdrafts that kick up powder-fine silt, hanging it in the air for hours, creating a disorienting, murky soup that extends for hundreds of miles. The mission planners had anticipated sandstorms, but their intelligence based on historical weather data had completely missed the probability of this specific, insidious condition. For the pilots of the 8 RH-53D Sea Stallion helicopters, it was like flying into a world without a horizon, without a sky, without a ground. There was only brown. The effects were immediate and catastrophic. This fine dust, almost like talcum powder, was a perfect abrasive. It sandblasted the acrylic cockpit windows, turning them opaque and forcing pilots to fly with their heads stuck out the side, peering through goggles into a blinding vortex. Worse, it began to eat away at the helicopters themselves. The giant rotor blades, the very heart of the machine's ability to fly, began to erode. The dust was ingested by the powerful turbine engines, choking them, raising their temperatures to dangerous levels, and clogging the delicate filters designed to protect them. Inside the cockpits, a storm of static electricity built up on the aircraft's skin, a phenomenon known as the P-static effect, causing compasses to spin wildly and navigation equipment to flicker and fail. The pilots were effectively flying blind in a storm that was actively trying to dismantle their machines in mid-air. The first domino fell about 2 hours into the flight. A warning light flashed in the cockpit of Bluebeard 6. A sensor indicated a critical crack in one of its main rotor blades, a potential sign of imminent, catastrophic failure. Following procedure, the pilot landed his multi-million-dollar machine in the vast, empty darkness. His crewmate from Bluebeard 8 landed beside him to investigate. It was no false alarm. The blade was compromised. The mission could not risk it disintegrating in flight. Bluebeard 6 was abandoned, its crew piling into Bluebeard 8. They were now down to 7 helicopters. The plan had called for 8, allowing for 1 or even 2 failures. The margin for error had just vanished. Then, deep inside the second Haboob, an even more insidious failure struck Bluebeard 5. Its primary flight instruments went dead. The gyroscopic systems that told the pilot his attitude, whether he was climbing, diving, or banking, had failed. Flying visually was impossible. He was a blind man in a sensory deprivation tank, 1,000 feet above the ground with no way of knowing which way was up. Vertigo set in almost instantly. To continue on was suicide. With no way to communicate with the rest of the force, the pilot made the only sane decision he could. He aborted, turning his crippled machine around and painstakingly navigating back toward the USS Nimitz. No one else in the formation even knew he was gone. They were now down to 6 helicopters, the absolute bare-bones minimum required to carry the assault team and their equipment. The mission now hung by a single fraying thread. Hours late, battered and exhausted, the 6 remaining Sea Stallions finally descended upon Desert 1. The sight was surreal. The C-130s were already on the ground, their engines idling, their crews anxiously scanning the dark horizon. But the landing itself revealed another unforeseen enemy: the ground. The desert floor was not hard-packed sand, but a deep loose powder called fesh. As the helicopters came into land, their powerful rotor wash kicked up immense blinding clouds of this dust, creating a localized brownout worse than anything they'd flown through. The pilots had to fight their machines all the way to the ground, landing on instruments and instinct alone. The mission was already in deep trouble. They were over 90 minutes behind schedule, a delay that threw the entire intricate timeline into chaos. The sun would be rising before they could ever reach the hideout site near Tehran. But then came the final, fatal blow. As the crews did their post-flight checks, the team aboard Bluebeard 2 discovered a catastrophic failure. A high-pressure hydraulic line had cracked, draining the primary system that controlled the helicopter's flight surfaces. A secondary system was still working, but the flight manual was unequivocal. With a failure of that magnitude, the aircraft was not safe to fly. It was grounded. They now had only 5 working helicopters. Colonel Charlie Beckwith, the tough, legendary founder of Delta Force, faced an impossible choice. 5 helicopters were not enough. The calculations were brutal and simple. He could not fit all 132 assaulters, plus the 52 hostages, into 5 choppers for the extraction. Someone would have to be left behind. Leaving hostages was unthinkable. Leaving his own men was anathema. The mission as planned was now mathematically impossible. After a tense, hurried conference on the salt flat, under the dim red light of the C-130's cargo bay, the recommendation was passed up the chain of command: across continents, to a sleep-deprived president in the White House Situation Room. The word came back: abort. The feeling at Desert One was one of profound, soul-crushing defeat. But the immediate task was to get everyone out safely and cleanly. The plan was to refuel the remaining helicopters for the long flight back to the Nimitz, load all the troops onto the C-130s, and vanish into the night. It was during this consolidation that failure cascaded into outright tragedy. One of the EC-130s, a specialized version of the aircraft carrying massive inflatable fuel bladders, was refueling the helicopters. To clear the area for takeoff, one of the Sea Stallion's Bluebeard 3 needed to be moved. A combat controller stood on the ground, trying to guide the pilot as he attempted to hover taxi a few yards across the makeshift airstrip. But as the pilot, exhausted and stressed, lifted the 20-ton helicopter into a low hover, the rotor wash once again kicked up an impenetrable wall of dust. The ground controller, the C-130, everything, disappeared into the brownout. The pilot was instantly utterly disoriented. He had no visual references. He couldn't tell if he was drifting forward, backward, or sideways. The human brain, deprived of its visual cues, cannot distinguish between turning and tilting. Believing he was drifting backward, the pilot pushed the cyclic stick forward to correct, but he wasn't drifting. He was stationary. The helicopter lurched forward. The ground controller, seeing disaster unfold, sprinted away. The 44-foot-long main rotor of the Sea Stallion, spinning at over 200 revolutions per minute, sliced directly into the cockpit and forward fuselage of the EC-130. The result was an apocalypse. The C-130, loaded with thousands of gallons of jet fuel and hydraulic fluid, erupted in a colossal fireball that turned the pitch-black desert night into day. The helicopter, itself full of fuel, disintegrated on impact. The explosion sent a shockwave and a shower of burning shrapnel across the site. Ammunition inside the plane began to cook off, creating secondary explosions that sent deadly projectiles whipping through the chaos. Men were knocked off their feet, some engulfed in flames. For a moment there was only the deafening roar and the searing, unimaginable heat. Then came the screams. The orderly, if dejected, withdrawal had become a frantic fight for survival. The order was screamed across the site: "Get on the planes! Everybody get on the planes!" In the panic, the remaining helicopter crews abandoned their perfectly good aircraft and scrambled for the C-130s. They left everything behind: the dead, the 4 intact multi-million-dollar helicopters, weapons, equipment, and most damningly of all, maps and secret documents detailing the entire rescue plan, right down to the names of CIA agents in Tehran. A mission conceived in secrecy and designed for surgical precision had ended in a disastrous, chaotic, and fiery retreat, leaving its secrets scattered on the desert floor for the whole world to see. For the men on the ground, the universe was reduced to a single moment of blinding white heat and overwhelming sound. It was not an explosion they witnessed, but one they felt in the marrow of their bones. The shockwave was a physical blow, a solid wall of pressure that picked men up and threw them dozens of feet, slamming them into the hard-packed sand or the cold steel skin of other aircraft. It sucked the air from their lungs, leaving them gasping in a sudden, terrifying vacuum. Then came the heat, a searing wave that blistered exposed skin in an instant and felt, as one man would later write, like opening the door to a blast furnace. The world, which seconds before had been a place of quiet tension and whispered orders under a canopy of stars, had ceased to exist. In its place was hell. In the flickering, monstrous light of the fire, the scene was a Bosch painting come to life. Men, their uniforms singed and smoking, stumbled through the darkness, their faces illuminated in brief, ghastly flashes. The constant, terrifying crackle of the inferno was punctuated by a new, more intimate horror: the sharp, percussive pop, pop, pop of ammunition cooking off inside the burning C-130. Each pop sent a bullet or a piece of shrapnel zinging blindly through the night. The site was no longer just a scene of an accident. It was a lethal shooting gallery with no cover. The screams began to cut through the roar of the fire, cries of pain, of shock, of men calling out for friends who would never answer. The smell was unimaginable, a thick, gagging cocktail of atomized jet fuel, superheated metal, burning rubber from the tires, and the sickeningly sweet, unforgettable odor of burnt flesh. It clung to the back of the throat and seared itself into the memory of every man who survived. A Delta Force operator who had been checking his gear near the C-130 was thrown 20 feet. He came to with his ears ringing so loudly he couldn't hear his own ragged breaths. The sand beneath him was vibrating. He pushed himself up, his training screaming at him to find his weapon, find his team, establish a perimeter. But his training had never accounted for this. His world was fire and screaming. He saw a teammate, a dark silhouette against the blaze, beating at his own legs with his hands, trying to extinguish the flames that were consuming him. He saw another man, a pilot, crawling away from the wreckage, his face a mask of black soot and shock. In that instant, these men were not the elite of the United States military. They were not Delta operators or Air Force commandos. They were just men, stripped bare by chaos and primal fear, their only instinct to get away from the all-consuming fire. Inside the cockpit of one of the other C-130s, the crew felt their aircraft buck violently, as if hit by a giant fist. The pilot, Major John Carney, saw the night turn to day in his cockpit window. His first thought was a terrorist attack, a bomb planted on the site. His co-pilot screamed, "We've been hit!" Carney's hands flew across the instrument panel, his mind racing, preparing for an emergency takeoff from a runway that was now an active disaster zone. Through the thick armored glass, he could see figures running, stumbling, falling. He knew that in the belly of his own plane were dozens of soldiers, utterly dependent on him to fly them out of the inferno. The weight of that responsibility was as immense and immediate as the heat radiating from the burning wreckage just a few hundred yards away. The order, when it came, was not a calm command, but a desperate, ragged shout, passed from man to man. Get on the planes. Everybody get on the planes. It was the signal that the mission was not just a failure, but a rout. Men scrambled, abandoning equipment where it lay. The surviving helicopter crews, men who had spent years mastering their complex machines, sprinted away from their perfectly intact sea stallions without a second glance. The shame of it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. In his diary, one would later confess it felt like abandoning a part of his own soul on that desert floor. But in the moment, there was no thought of multi-million-dollar hardware or military protocol. There was only the roaring fire behind them and the dark gaping ramp of the C-130 in front of them. A promise of escape, a gateway from hell back to the living world. Men poured up the ramp, a frantic, disorganized tide of bodies. They tripped over each other, pulling the wounded along with them. Inside the cavernous cargo bay was a scene of controlled chaos. Medics immediately went to work on the burned and injured, the red glow of their headlamps casting an eerie light on the grim proceedings. Colonel Charlie Beckwith, the grizzled, formidable commander of Delta Force, stood near the ramp, his face a grim mask, trying to conduct a desperate headcount. He shouted names into the din, pointing at men, trying to match faces to the roster now seared into his brain. The numbers weren't adding up. 5 men. Where were the other 5? He counted again, and again. The horrifying truth began to dawn on him and the other commanders. In the initial fireball and the panicked evacuation, men had been left behind. They were out there, somewhere in the burning wreckage. For a few agonizing seconds, the world stood still. The commander of the C-130, his engines screaming ready for takeoff, was yelling that they had to go now. The fire was spreading, and the chances of a secondary explosion engulfing them all grew with every passing moment. Beckwith was faced with the most terrible decision a commander can make: to risk the lives of the 80 or 90 men crammed into his aircraft for the 5 who were almost certainly already dead, or to leave his brothers, living or dead, behind. It was a choice that violated every warrior's creed, every fiber of his being. But the choice was also an illusion. To stay was suicide for everyone. The order was given. The ramp began to rise, sealing the survivors inside the dark, crowded fuselage and sealing the fate of those left outside. The takeoff was terrifying. The C-130 was overloaded with extra men and fuel, and the superheated air from the fire reduced the density of the atmosphere, robbing the wings of precious lift. The pilot firewalled the throttles, and the lumbering transport plane clawed its way down the makeshift desert strip, the flames of the burning wreckage licking at its wingtip. The men inside braced themselves, every bump and shudder sending a fresh wave of fear through the cabin. They were a flying tinderbox, a single stray piece of shrapnel away from joining the inferno they were fleeing. Then, they felt the rumbling of the ground fall away. They were airborne, they had escaped. But as the aircraft banked and climbed into the safety of the night sky, a profound and heavy silence fell over the men in the cargo bay. The roar of the fire was gone, replaced by the steady drone of the 4 turboprop engines. The adrenaline that had fueled their flight for survival began to ebb away, and in its place came the cold, creeping tide of shock, grief, and the crushing weight of utter failure. The air was thick with the smell of sweat, aviation fuel, and burnt cloth. Men sat slumped against the walls of the plane, their heads in their hands. Some stared blankly into the middle distance, their eyes reflecting a horror no one else could see. They were alive, but they had left a part of themselves back there in the fire. They had left their comrades. They had left the hostages. They had left their nation's honor smoldering in the Iranian desert. The flight from Desert One was short, but for the men who survived it, the journey home would last a lifetime. The first word of the disaster to reach Washington, D.C. came not as a thunderclap, but as a coded, cryptic whisper in the dead of night. For President Jimmy Carter, who had staked his presidency on the safe return of the 52 American hostages, the news was a physical blow. He had authorized a mission of immense complexity and risk, a roll of the dice against a fanatical regime, and he had lost. At 7 o'clock in the morning on April 25, 1980, a weary and visibly shaken president faced the nation. He took full and sole responsibility, his voice heavy with the gravity of the announcement. America, a nation accustomed to victory, woke up to the news of a stunning, almost unbelievable defeat. The world's reaction was a torrent of shock, pity, and scorn. For America's allies, it was a moment of deep concern. The seemingly invincible superpower had tried and failed, its military might apparently impotent against the chaos of the new Iran. For its adversaries, it was a propaganda gift from heaven. Moscow radio crowed about the adventurist flop of American imperialism. In Tehran, the reaction was ecstatic. Ayatollah Khomeini declared it a victory from God himself, claiming a divine sandstorm, an act of Allah, had risen up to smite the great Satan. The wreckage at Desert One was no longer a crash site, it became a shrine. Iranian television broadcast endless, haunting images to the world. The blackened skeletons of the RH-53 helicopter and the C-130 transport plane fused together in a final fiery embrace. They paraded the abandoned top-secret equipment and, in a ghoulish display of triumph, the charred remains of the American servicemen who had perished. For a nation already reeling from the Vietnam War and a decade of self-doubt, the images from the Iranian desert felt like a final, brutal humiliation. For the hostages themselves, locked away in the occupied embassy, the news arrived with cruel mockery. Their captors, delirious with victory, burst in to taunt them with the story of the failed rescue. For months, the hostages had clung to a sliver of hope that their country had not forgotten them. That hope, which they hadn't even dared to fully acknowledge, was now violently extinguished. It was replaced by a cold, terrifying reality. The rescue had failed. Their government's best effort had ended in disaster. And now their captors, emboldened and furious at the attempt, scattered them to more secure, hidden locations across Iran, plunging them deeper into the darkness and uncertainty of their captivity. Their ordeal was not only going to continue, it was going to get worse. Back in America, the political fallout was swift and merciless. Operation Eagle Claw became a symbol for everything critics claimed was wrong with the Carter presidency: weakness, indecision, and incompetence. The mission's failure fed a narrative of an America in decline, a giant humbled on the world stage. It became the final heavy anchor that would pull his presidency under in the election later that year. The promise of a new morning in America, offered by his challenger Ronald Reagan, seemed all the more appealing against the grim, smoky backdrop of Desert One. Yet, in the smoldering ashes of this catastrophe, a painful and profound self-examination began. The post-mortems conducted by the Pentagon were brutal and unflinching. They revealed a military dangerously fragmented by inter-service rivalry. The Army, Navy, Air Force and Marines had planned and executed the mission as separate fiefdoms, not as a unified whole. Communications were incompatible. Command structure was convoluted. The helicopter pilots had never trained with the C-130 pilots. The Delta Force commandos had never rehearsed with the helicopter crews in realistic conditions. It was a symphony of failure, with each section playing from a different sheet of music. The disaster laid bare a shocking truth. America had the world's best special forces, but it had no idea how to use them together. The legacy of Desert One, therefore, is a profound paradox. It was an absolute, unmitigated tactical and strategic failure, but it became the single greatest catalyst for military reform in the late 20th century. The lessons learned in that burning desert were paid for in blood and honor, and they would not be forgotten. From this single failure, the entire structure of American special operations was rebuilt from the ground up. In 1987, the United States Special Operations Command, or SOCOM, was born, a unified command with its own budget, its own doctrines, and the authority to bring together elite units from every branch of the service. The Goldwater-Nichols Act of 1986 further streamlined the entire military chain of command, forcing the services to work together. The elite, ruthlessly efficient and lethally effective special operations forces that would become famous in the decades to follow, from Panama to Pakistan, were forged in the fire of this one disastrous night. The hostages would not be rescued by commandos. They would be freed by diplomacy after 4 agonizing days of captivity. In a final, bitter twist of fate for Jimmy Carter, the deal was struck in his final hours as president. The plane carrying the freed Americans to freedom lifted off from the runway in Tehran on January 20th, 1981, just minutes after Ronald Reagan had taken the oath of office. Carter had secured their freedom, but Reagan would welcome them home. History rarely offers simple verdicts. Operation Eagle Claw stands as a monument to failure, a story of brave men undone by mechanical malfunction, bad luck, and flawed planning. 8 men died in the desert, not in combat with an enemy, but in a tragic accident born of desperation. Their sacrifice seemed at the time to have been for nothing, but their deaths served as a terrifying wake-up call. The mission to rescue 52 people failed, but the lessons learned from that failure would go on to reshape the American military, enabling it to project power in a way that was unimaginable before that fateful night. The memory of Desert One is a ghost that haunts the highest levels of military command to this day, a searing reminder that even for the world's greatest superpower, the distance between a heroic rescue and a historic disaster can be as thin and treacherous as a swirl of desert sand in the dark.